Regulatory uncertainty. Well, that's always a challenge. Mike, why don't you tell us about the FCC order that's soon to be released and what that will do for regulatory certainty or uncertainty?
Sure. So thanks, Ken. Yeah, so the FCC is now considering an order that will, I think in many ways, fundamentally remake and update the federal universal service mechanisms that a lot of small companies depend upon to deliver service in the areas in which they operate. The order will resolve, I think, in some ways, things have been kicking around for a long time, and in many ways have been things that we've been expecting and been concerned about in terms of rate of return represcription, for example, and some other operating expense limits and things like that. There's been a lot of uncertainty around what will the FCC do there for years now. So there are things that we necessarily wouldn't have wanted the FCC to act on. There are things that could reduce support for some companies in some ways. At the same time, what we're hopeful we'll see out of this is they'll end up in a better place than people might have feared, and hopefully give people the ability at the very least to start planning again, start thinking, all right, well, I know the regulatory landscape now in a way, it's settled in a way that it hasn't been in years, and will that give me the opportunity to plan, to think about how do I get financing, how do I go invest, where can I invest, who can I invest to serve? Again, it's not going to be a perfect system. There are going to be things we're going to be working on even after the order's released, things we're going to have to get fixed, but the idea would be that at least it'll give people a more settled landscape than they've had in years with respect to choosing to go forward. The other thing that I think we're hoping we'll see out of the order is updates to the mechanisms in a way that they needed to be updated. So I mentioned the sort of dispelling some regulatory uncertainty, some of the things we wouldn't have liked to see. But also, we're hopeful we'll see some changes that are positive in this order in the form of an update to the universal service mechanisms to allow people to offer broadband in a more direct way than they have in the past. I don't think it'll be a fix for that issue, but it'll be an important step, a tool that people have in their toolkit to deliver broadband to customers on a standalone basis that they haven't had in the past. They may not necessarily be able to make all the economics work, but it will improve the economics. And so that's an important first step and gives us another platform from which to advocate for greater support over time to really fuel that engine and give people the standalone broadband support they need. The other side of this will be a model election that companies can elect. It's voluntary, but it's important that those companies that want to take the model have the ability to do so, and that it doesn't have an effect on those companies that do not take the model, which we understand to be the case here. But then gives those companies the ability to, in turn, to think about how do they start building broadband in the areas they serve where they haven't been able to date, which is really what the model's focused on. Mm-hmm. So all things we hope that will come out of the order. It's going to be important to see how they come out on the printed page. We know there are things that always, when you're moving around something this complex, things fall out, springs are loose, you find an extra nail or screw here or there that you need to fix and figure out where it goes. We know that's going to happen. We also are very focused on those things that don't work and that do have an adverse, unintended consequence on members. We've got to get back in there right away and be ready to fix those. We've already put the FCC and Congress on notice that those are things we're going to be very focused on. So we'll be right back in there once this order's out. But for right now, we're hopeful we'll see some good pieces fall into place. And for those that don't, we'll be right back at it.
Well, and so as you're solving kind of one certainty issue, then another one pops up in this form of broadband privacy. And my question to you is, well, is it different than CP&I?
Well, that's an interesting one. Another one where, when the words are on the printed page, it'll be very interesting to see what they say. What we're talking about now is a notice of rulemaking that the FCC is expected to issue at the end of March. And in that rulemaking, they're going to be taking steps for the first time to apply CP&I rules that were really developed initially to protect telephone consumer data and certain kinds of telephone consumer data. And that's a really important point. They're now talking about morphing those rules, mapping them now to a broadband world. And there are two important questions that I see in that. The first is, what data are we talking about protecting? And that's the interesting thing. The FCC put out a fact sheet on this. They call it a fact sheet. And probably what I would consider the most important fact, which is what data are we talking about exactly, was missing from that fact sheet. They talk about protecting consumer privacy, consumer data with respect to usage of broadband, but what does that mean? Mm-hmm. That's not clear yet in the fact sheet, and that's going to be an important part of the puzzle to determine, are we talking about protecting the data that people would, in a common sense way, think would be protectable? Maybe that's something that's workable for companies. They may already be doing it today in their operations in terms of protecting consumer data generally. So that's one important piece. The other important piece will be obviously the different rules. Are we talking about things that build upon including data within the existing sets of protections that companies make available for data? Or are we talking about now also a bit of mission creep and expanding the ways in which the obligations that companies will have to comply with in order to protect data, not only for broadband, but now also for telephone too. Maybe it's also something where we're seeing this not only used as an update for broadband, but also something that expands burdens, and that's where we're very concerned as well. The final note I just make is it's intriguing to me that you've got a system in place that's protecting consumer data based upon internet service provider networks, but those who probably have some of the greatest insight and access to consumer data, search engines, folks like that who you're always interacting with, they're outside the scope of the rules here. And it'll be very interesting to see. We're protecting data at one point in the network, but there are other points that where real mission critical failures could occur and expose all sorts of consumer data, and they're wholly outside the scope of these rules.
Yeah, well, it sounds like we'll have something to catch up with at IP Vision then.
Yes, absolutely.
By that time, there'll be some rules, and we'll be able to talk about it then.
That'd be great. Thanks, Ken.
Mike.
Look forward to it. Thanks.
Likewise.
Take care.